The massive red star that had given life to the Zephyrian world for countless ages began to die without any warning. Deep in space, the giant ball of fire started to collapse on itself, sending deadly waves of energy across the solar system. Commander Marcus Webb stared at the glowing screens in front of him, his face growing pale as the numbers kept getting worse. The readings made no sense. According to every computer model they had, this star should have lived for millions more years. Now it was dying in a matter of days. "All ships, this is an emergency," came the voice of Admiral Victoria Hayes through the communication system. "The Zephyrian sun is collapsing faster than we thought possible. Begin immediate evacuation of all life forms." Around the dying world, hundreds of massive ships from different alien races worked together to save as many lives as possible. The tall, silver Altarians moved with cold efficiency, loading transport after transport with blue-scaled Zephyrian adults. The four-armed Centaurans calculated exactly how many could fit in each vessel, making sure no space was wasted. Dr. Emma Clark watched it all from the human observation deck on the main council ship. She had been sent to study how different species work together during emergencies. What she saw both amazed and worried her. The alien races worked like perfect machines, but something felt wrong. Emma pulled up the evacuation lists on her tablet computer. Name after name scrolled by, thousands of adult Zephyrians marked as rescued. Scientists, engineers, teachers, government officials. All the important people were being saved first, just as the emergency protocols required. But something was missing from the lists. Emma scrolled faster, checking and double-checking. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized what was wrong. "Admiral Hayes," Emma called out, rushing to the command center. "I need to speak with you immediately." The Admiral turned from her conversation with the Altarian fleet commander. "What is it, Dr. Clark?" "We're rather busy saving an entire civilization." Emma held up her tablet. "The evacuation manifests, I've been through all of them. Where are the children? The nursery colonies?" A moment of silence fell over the command center. The Altarian commander's translation device clicked and whirred before speaking in its mechanical voice. "The juvenile population centers are located in the outer system. Current projections indicate insufficient time and resources for secondary evacuation priorities." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Secondary priorities? They're children. The Centauran delegate joined the conversation, his forearms moving in what Emma had learned was their version of a shrug. "Dr. Clark, you must understand the mathematics of survival. We have calculated the optimal use of our rescue capacity. Adult Zephyrians can reproduce and rebuild their civilization. The juveniles, while unfortunate, represent an acceptable statistical loss." Acceptable loss? Emma's voice rose higher than she intended. "We're talking about babies." The Altarian commander's device translated his response with the same cold tone as always. "They are not our offspring. Emotional attachment to alien young serves no logical purpose. Resources spent saving them could save twice as many productive adults." Emma looked around the command center at the various alien representatives. Every face she saw showed the same cold calculation. They had decided that thousands of children would die, and they felt nothing about it. "Admiral Hayes," Emma turned to the only other human present. "Surely we can do something?" The Admiral looked uncomfortable but shook her head. "Emma, I understand how you feel, but we only have 2 small ships here. The aliens are right about the math. We can't save everyone." As the hours passed, Emma watched ship after ship leave the dying system, loaded with adult Zephyrians. The great rescue operation was being declared a success. Over 2 million lives saved, the news reports would say. A triumph of interspecies cooperation. But Emma kept thinking about the outer colonies. About the nursery stations where Zephyrian children waited for help that would never come. She had seen pictures of them during her research, small blue creatures with large eyes, not much different from human children in the way they played and learned. She tried one last time to convince the alien commanders. "What if we just send a few ships? Just to check on them?" The Centauran delegate pulled up his calculations on a holographic display. The outer colonies contain approximately 3,200 juvenile Zephyrians. To mount a rescue operation would require at least 15 ships and endanger over 4,000 crew members. The probability of success is less than 30%. The logical choice is clear. Emma stared at the numbers floating in the air. Each digit represented a child who would be left to die alone and afraid as their world ended. The alien races had reduced living beings to simple math problems. "Besides," added the Altarian commander, The juveniles have already been without their adult caretakers for 18 hours. Their survival systems are likely failing. Even if we attempted rescue, most would perish before evacuation could be completed. The final evacuation ship prepared to leave. Emma stood at the observation window, watching the Zephyrian homeworld grow smaller in the distance. Somewhere on that dying planet, in stations scattered throughout the outer system, children waited in the dark. The news of the successful evacuation spread quickly through the galaxy. Every civilized world praised the courage and efficiency of the rescue operation. 2 million lives saved in less than 48 hours. It would go down in history as one of the greatest humanitarian efforts ever attempted. But when the reports reached Earth, President James Morrison read between the lines. He called an emergency meeting that would last through the night. By morning, humanity would give an answer that would shock the galaxy. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't what makes sense on paper, it's what makes sense in your heart. Captain David Thompson gripped the steering controls as his ship shook like a toy in a storm. The Endeavour was built tough, but nothing was built for what they were trying to do. Around him, 11 other human ships pushed deeper into the dying Zephyrian system, flying straight into danger that would make any sane person turn around. "Captain, the radiation readings are going crazy," called out Lieutenant Rebecca Foster from her station. Her face was pale, but her voice stayed steady. "The ship's hull is holding together, but I don't know for how much longer." David looked at the main screen where red warning lights blinked everywhere. The dying star ahead of them was throwing out deadly energy that could cook them all in seconds. Behind them, the safe zone was getting farther away with each passing minute. "Any word from the other ships?" David asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Captain Miller on the Courage says his engines are running hot, but is still with us," Rebecca reported. "The Defiance is taking heavy damage to their outer hull, but Captain Wilson refuses to turn back." David nodded. Every person on these 12 ships was a volunteer. When the call had gone out on Earth asking for crews willing to attempt an impossible rescue, thousands had stepped forward. These were teachers, mechanics, doctors, and farmers who had never been soldiers, but who could not sleep knowing children were dying while the galaxy did nothing. Through the front window, space itself seemed to be twisting and bending. The gravity from the collapsing star was so strong it was warping reality around them. David had to trust his instruments completely because his eyes could not make sense of what they were seeing. "Contact ahead," announced Navigator Lucy Bennett, her voice tight with excitement. "First nursery station coming into view." On the screen appeared a beautiful crystal structure, like a giant diamond floating in space. It was designed by Zephyrian architects to be perfect for raising their young, temperature-controlled, with special lighting that matched their home sun. But now the lights were flickering, and sections of the station were already dark. "Life signs?" David asked. Lucy checked her readings twice before answering. "I'm picking up small heat signatures. Lots of them. They're still alive, Captain." David felt his heart speed up. After flying for 36 hours through the most dangerous space in the galaxy, they had found survivors. "Take us in close. Signal the rescue teams." What David saw next would stay with him for the rest of his life. Through the clear walls of the station, dozens of small blue figures pressed against the windows. Even from a distance, he could see they were just babies, some no bigger than human toddlers. They had been watching space, waiting for someone to come help them. The rescue operation that followed was like nothing anyone had ever attempted. Human crews, wearing thick protective suits, cut through the station walls and crawled inside. The air was thin and cold, and the artificial gravity was failing in some sections. But the children were alive. "They are so small," whispered Dr. Patricia Hughes as she carefully lifted a Zephyrian cub into her arms. The little creature looked up at her with large, bright eyes and made a sound that was almost like purring. Moving the children from the station to the human ships was dangerous work. The radiation outside was getting stronger by the hour, and several rescue workers had to be pulled back when their protective suits started failing. But not one person complained or asked to stop. "Station 2 in sight," called Lucy from the navigation station several hours later. This one was in worse shape. Half the lights were out, and part of the structure was cracked. When the rescue teams got inside, they found the children huddled together in the center section, sharing warmth and the last of their food supplies. By the time they reached the 4th station, the Defiance was in serious trouble. Captain Robert Chen's voice crackled over the radio with heavy interference. "We've lost main power and life support is failing," he reported. "But we've got 4 to 7 cubs on board, and we're not leaving them behind." David made the hardest decision of his life. "All ships, this is Endeavour. We're redistributing the children from Defiance to other vessels. Transfer operations begin immediately. What happened next showed the best of human nature. Crews from other ships formed a chain in space, passing the small Zephyrian cubs from one person to another across the dangerous void. When Captain Chen's ship finally gave up and went dark, every single child had been moved to safety. The final count came 18 hours later, when the last rescue ship cleared the danger zone. Dr. Hughes read the numbers with tears in her eyes: 3,247 Zephyrian cubs rescued. 0 casualties. 0 left behind. The galaxy had declared it impossible. The greatest military minds and computer systems had calculated that such a rescue could not be done. The math said it would fail, the science said it was suicide, and the logic said it was not worth trying. But math and science and logic had not counted on one thing: humans who refused to let children die alone. As the battered human fleet limped back towards safe space, carrying their precious cargo of rescued lives, the galaxy watched in stunned silence. News reports struggled to find words for what they had witnessed. Some called it madness, others called it miracle. The children themselves seemed to sense they were safe now. In the rescue ships, they clung to their human rescuers and made sounds that could only be joy. Dr. Helen Parker had spent 20 years studying how different alien species behaved, but nothing in her education had prepared her for what she was seeing on the human colony of New Devon. She walked through the residential district, taking notes on her tablet, trying to make sense of something that should have been impossible. In front of a small house with a blue door, she stopped and watched 8-year-old Tommy Watson kick a soccer ball around his front yard. But Tommy was not alone. 3 small blue creatures, each about half his height, chased after the ball with surprising speed and coordination. Their scales caught the sunlight as they ran, and they made high-pitched sounds that could only be described as laughter. Helen checked her research files again. According to everything written about Zephyrians, they did not laugh. Adult members of their species had never been observed making sounds of joy or playing games. They were logical, quiet, and focused only on learning and working. Yet here were Zephyrian children acting like any group of happy kids. "Tommy," Helen called out. "Can I ask you about your friends?" The boy stopped kicking the ball and wiped sweat from his forehead. "You mean Zeph and Kira and Blue?" He pointed to each of the small aliens. "They're awesome at soccer. Way better than my human friends." One of the Zephyrian cubs, the one Tommy called Blue, ran up to Helen and tugged on her sleeve. The little creature looked up at her with bright, curious eyes and said something in its own language that sounded like music. "He wants to know if you'll play with us," Tommy explained. "He's still learning English, but he's getting pretty good." Helen knelt down to Blue's level. In all her research, she had never read about Zephyrian children being curious about strangers or wanting to include them in games. Adult Zephyrians barely acknowledged other species unless it was for official business. Across the street, Margaret Davis was hanging laundry on her clothesline when 3 more Zephyrian cubs came running out of her house. They wrapped their small arms around her legs and chatted excitedly in a mix of their own language and broken English. Mama Maggie," the smallest one called out. "We finished our homework. Can we have cookies now?" Margaret laughed and patted each small head gently. "Of course, sweethearts. Go wash your hands first." Helen watched in amazement as the cubs raced back into the house. She had read Margaret's file. The woman had volunteered to foster Zephyrian children even though she had never raised kids of her own. According to the reports, it should have been a disaster. Zephyrian young needed special food, specific temperatures, and careful monitoring of their health. Most experts had predicted the foster program would fail within weeks. Instead, it was working better than anyone had imagined possible. "Mrs. Davis," Helen called out as she approached. "How do you do it? The children seem so happy with you." Margaret smiled as she continued hanging sheets on the line. "I just treat them like I would any children. They need love, attention, and someone who cares about them. Species doesn't really matter when it comes to that. But the cultural differences, the special needs." "Oh, they have some special needs, sure," Margaret agreed. "They like their room a bit cooler than human children, and they eat different food. But they also like bedtime stories, they want hugs when they're scared, and they get excited about birthday parties just like any kid would." That afternoon, Helen visited Dr. William Foster at the colony's research center. He was a child development expert who had been studying the rescued Zephyrian cubs for 6 months. His findings were revolutionizing everything scientists thought they knew about the species. "It's incredible, Helen," William said, showing her brain scans on his computer. "Look at these neural pathways in the Zephyrian children. These sections here control emotional responses, play behavior, and social bonding. In adult Zephyrians, these areas are almost completely inactive. But in the cubs raised by humans, they're lighting up like fireworks. Helen studied the colorful brain images. What does that mean? It means that Zephyrian brains are capable of much more than their society ever allowed, William explained. For thousands of years, they've raised their children to suppress emotions and focus only on logic. But human families are doing something different. They're encouraging the cubs to express feelings, to play, to form deep emotional connections. And it's actually changing how their brains develop. The proof was everywhere Helen looked. In the colony school, she watched human and Zephyrian children work together on art projects, creating wild paintings full of color and imagination. The young Zephyrians drew pictures of their foster families, showing humans and aliens holding hands under bright suns and rainbow skies. At dinner time in the foster family home, she observed something that would have shocked adult Zephyrians. Two cubs named Seth and Kari argued about who got the last piece of cake, then made up by sharing it. They showed anger, then forgiveness, then joy, a complete range of emotions that their species considered weaknesses. The biggest surprise came when adult Zephyrians began visiting the colony to see their rescued young. Elder Zephy, an important leader from their homeworld, stood in Margaret Davis's living room watching his nephew play with wooden blocks. "This is not how Zephyrian children behave," he said quietly to Helen, his voice filled with confusion. On the floor, little Zephy looked up at his uncle and smiled, another behavior that did not exist in adult Zephyrian society. The child ran over and wrapped his arms around the elder's legs in an enthusiastic hug. Elder Zephy stood frozen, clearly not knowing how to respond. In his culture, physical affection was seen as a sign of weakness and poor discipline. "Uncle Zeph," the child said happily. "Want to see my drawing? Mama Maggie helped me make it." For the first time in recorded history, an adult Zephyrian's eyes filled with tears. 20-year-old Zephyr stood at the center of the Great Galactic Council chamber, her blue scales shimmering under the bright lights. She looked completely Zephyrian on the outside, but when she spoke, her voice carried warmth and passion that no adult of her species had ever shown before. "Honored members of the council," she began, her words echoing through the massive hall. "I stand before you today as living proof that love has no boundaries between species." In the viewing section above, her foster father Jonathan Miller watched with pride. Beside him sat Elder Vexhai, her biological uncle, who still struggled to understand the strange emotions he felt when watching his niece. The contrast between the two was striking. Jonathan beamed with parental love, while Vexhai looked confused and uncomfortable with feelings he had never learned to express. 20 years ago, my people faced extinction, Zephyr continued. The galaxy wrote us off as acceptable losses. Only humanity refused to abandon us. They saved not just our lives, but something far more precious, they saved our ability to feel joy. Around the council chamber, representatives from dozens of different species listened with growing interest. The rigid Altarians, who had dismissed the human rescue as emotional waste, now faced reports that their own young were asking questions about feelings and friendship after meeting the human-raised Zephyrians. Ambassador Korvac from the Altarian delegation shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His own son had recently returned from a diplomatic visit to New Devon, asking why the Zephyrian children seemed so much happier than Altarian youth. The question had kept Korvac awake for many nights. "The humans did not just give us new homes," Zephyr explained. "They gave us new hearts. When I was small and scared, my foster mother Sarah Miller would hold me until I felt safe. When I made mistakes, my foster father taught me that failures were chances to learn, not reasons for shame. When I felt sad, they showed me it was okay to cry." Dr. Patricia Hughes, now Earth's chief representative to the Council, stepped forward with her research findings. "What we discovered about the Zephyrian children has changed everything we thought we knew about emotional development across species," she announced. On the large screens around the chamber, Patricia showed brain scans and behavioral studies. The human approach to child-rearing, treating all young as individuals deserving of love and protection, activated dormant neural pathways not just in Zephyrians, but in several other species as well. A murmur ran through the assembly as delegates saw the evidence. The Centauran ambassador raised one of his forearms to ask a question. "Dr. Hughes, are you suggesting that our traditional methods of raising young are incomplete?" Patricia nodded carefully. "What I'm suggesting is that many species may have abilities for emotional connection and creativity that their societies never encouraged. The human model seems to unlock these abilities." In the weeks following Zephyr's speech, something remarkable began happening across the galaxy. On the Altarian homeworld, parents started reading bedtime stories to their children instead of just providing educational data files. Young Altarians began drawing pictures and playing games, activities that had been forbidden for generations. The change was even more dramatic among the Centaurans. Their society had always been based on rigid social levels, with each person knowing exactly their place from birth. But when some Centauran families began adopting human child-rearing methods, their young started questioning why some people were considered more important than others. Elder Morthek of the Centauran High Council found himself facing the strangest conversation of his very long life when his great-grandson asked him, "Grandfather, why can't I be friends with children from lower social groups? The human children play with everyone." On distant worlds, the effects continued to spread. The warlike Krugan species had always trained their young for battle from an early age. But after observing how peaceful and happy the human-raised children were, some Krugan parents began wondering if there might be better ways to prepare their offspring for life. Commander Thrak of the Krugan Defense Force watched his daughter play with a group of mixed-species children at a diplomatic gathering. For the first time in Krugan history, young warriors were learning to solve conflicts through talking rather than fighting. "Perhaps," Thrak said to his mate, "strength comes in forms we never considered." The most surprising change came from the ancient vegan collective, a species so old and advanced that they had long ago decided emotions were primitive leftovers from their evolutionary past. But when young vegans began showing curiosity about the laughter and joy they observed in human colonies, even their eldest philosophers began to reconsider. Dr. Veltar, who had spent 300 years studying pure logic, found herself watching recordings of human families with fascination. These beings achieve cooperation and progress through emotional bonds, she noted in her research. Perhaps we discarded something valuable when we eliminated feelings from our society. Back on Earth, President Diana Foster addressed the growing movement that was sweeping across known space. "We never intended to change the galaxy," she said in her speech to the United Nations. "We just couldn't stand by and watch children suffer. But maybe that's exactly what the galaxy needed, someone who put hearts before calculations." The transformation was not without challenges. On several worlds, traditional leaders fought against the new ways of thinking. Some species struggled with the concept that their ancient methods might need changing. But the children themselves were the strongest argument for change. Wherever the human approach to child-rearing was tried, young beings became happier, more creative, and more cooperative. They formed friendships across species lines that had been enemies for centuries. As Zephyr had said in her famous speech, love was proving to be the most powerful force in the galaxy. 50 years had passed since the Great Rescue, and Ambassador Zephyr stood in the completely transformed Galactic Council chambers, watching her own daughter play in the cultural exchange gardens with children from 7 different species. The cold, sterile halls of logic had been replaced with warm spaces where families gathered and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. "Hard to believe it all started with one impossible rescue mission," said Admiral Thomas Clark, now old and grey but still sharp in his thinking, as he joined Zephyr at the viewing window. Zephyr smiled, an expression that would have horrified her ancestors but now seemed as natural as breathing. "My foster mother Mary Miller used to tell me that love grows bigger when you share it. I never understood what she meant until I became a mother myself." Below them in the gardens, Zephyr's daughter Zephylin was teaching a group of young Altarians how to paint with watercolors. Instead of the precise technical drawings their culture had always preferred, the children were creating wild splashes of color that showed pure emotion and joy. Their parents watched from nearby benches with expressions of wonder, still amazed by their children's newfound creativity. The transformation had been slow but unstoppable. What historians now called the human doctrine had spread through trade routes and diplomatic missions like seeds carried on the wind. Species that had maintained rigid social rules for thousands of years were discovering the simple joy of treating their young as individuals rather than future workers. On the Krugan homeworld, former warriors now taught conflict resolution in schools. Children who once would have been trained to fight from age 5 were instead learning to solve problems through communication and cooperation. The Krugan military, once the most feared force in the galaxy, had become the most effective peacekeeping organization known to civilized space. The Centauran caste system, which had divided their society into rigid levels for millennia, had completely collapsed within one generation. When children began asking why some people were considered more important than others, their parents found they had no good answers. Now Centauran society was based on individual talents and interests rather than the family you were born into. Even the ancient vegans, who had spent centuries perfecting pure logical thinking, had rediscovered the value of emotions. Their latest scientific breakthroughs came not from cold calculation, but from researchers who were passionate about their work and collaborated with enthusiasm rather than mere duty. President Diana Foster, great-granddaughter of one of the original rescue volunteers, stood at the podium in the main assembly hall to deliver the 50th anniversary address. Representatives from over 200 worlds filled the chamber, including species that had been discovered and welcomed into galactic society using the new principles of universal acceptance. When our ancestors refused to abandon those children, Diana began, they were not just saving lives. They were planting the seeds of a better galaxy. They showed us that the most important question is not what is logical, or what is efficient, but what is right. The audience included beings that previous generations would never have imagined working together. Former enemy species now collaborated on joint research projects. The ancient practice of writing off entire populations as acceptable losses had become not just unthinkable, but literally impossible under the new Galactic Charter of Universal Rights. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the current Director of Interspecies Child Development, presented her latest findings to the Assembly. We now have 50 years of data proving that societies which adopt nurturing, inclusive child-rearing practices show dramatic improvements in creativity, cooperation, and overall happiness. Crime rates have dropped by 90% on worlds that implemented these changes. Scientific advancement has accelerated beyond our wildest predictions. In the research sections of the station, scientists from dozens of species worked side by side on projects that would benefit the entire galaxy. The old competition between races had been replaced by collaboration driven by genuine care for one another's welfare. Young Zephyrin finished her painting lesson and ran up to the viewing window where her mother stood. Her small hands were covered in bright colors, and her eyes sparkled with the joy of creation. "Mama, look what we made," she said, holding up a painting that showed beings from many different worlds holding hands under a sky full of stars. "Teacher Marcus said we should paint what makes us happy, so I painted all my friends." Zephyre knelt down to her daughter's level and studied the beautiful, chaotic artwork. In the painting, the differences between species, blue scales, silver skin, multiple arms, different sizes, were celebrated rather than feared. The children had instinctively understood something that their ancestors had taken decades to learn. "It's wonderful, sweetheart," Zephyre said, giving her daughter a hug. "You painted exactly what the galaxy has become." As evening approached, families throughout the station gathered for the traditional sharing meal, a custom that had evolved from human practices but now belonged to all species. At tables throughout the dining halls, parents and children from different worlds sat together, sharing food and stories and laughter. Admiral Clark joined Zephyre's family for dinner, as he had done every week for the past 10 years. As he watched the mixed group of children chattering excitedly about their day, he thought about the rescue crews who had risked everything 5 decades ago. "They'd be proud," he said quietly to Zephyre as they watched the children play after dinner. Zephyre nodded, touching the memorial plaque on the wall that honored the original rescue volunteers. Many of those brave humans were gone now, but their legacy lived in every laugh, every friendship between different species, every moment when someone chose compassion over calculation. The galaxy had learned humanity's greatest lesson: sometimes the most logical thing to do is follow your heart. And the children would carry that lesson to the stars.